When we think about Russian interference in this 2016 election, when we talk about the active measures against our democracy, we're often talking about basically three components. You can think of the first as the Russian hacking, the dissemination of those stolen campaign emails. We remember that. Number two, the Russian attempts to actually hack into state election systems. And then the third is what we were actually just touching on, the influence operations to target Americans on social media sites to disrupt our discussions that we thought we were having with each other. But then there's another mysterious thing that also was happening in 2016 that we're still learning about, and it had to do with Russian diplomats inside this country. Politico reporting it this way. This was a story actually first published in the summer of 2017. These diplomats, widely assumed to be intelligence operatives, would eventually turn up in odd places, often in middle of nowhere USA. One found on a beach. Another turned up wandering around in the middle of the desert. Both seem to be lingering where underground fiber optic cables tend to run. Their whereabouts led intelligence officials to conclude the Kremlin's waging a quiet effort to map the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure, perhaps preparing for an opportunity to disrupt it. Now, nobody knew exactly what to make of that report at that time. This issue has been kind of dormant, really, until this spring. That is when the U.S. officially accused Russia of not only the things we just mentioned, but also of targeting power plants, water, and electrical grids during the campaign and ongoing during the Trump presidency. Now, those Russian diplomats wandering around the U.S. and showing up in strange places, that remained a mystery until this week, resurfacing, and this is something, during a little-noticed exchange at a Senate hearing on Russian interference. Victoria Nuland, who's the top diplomat in the Obama administration, testifying before the Intelligence Committee. Nuland asked about those wandering Russians by Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins.
Ambassador Nuland, in 2016, the FBI was complaining to this committee that Russian diplomats in the United States were not following the established rules about travel, and they were not notifying the State Department. And it seemed that they were traveling to odd locations on short notice. Were you aware at the State Department of the FBI's concerns?
Yes, Senator. We had significant conversations with the FBI about their concerns and took some actions and prepared others as early as July and August of 2016 with regard to their concerns.
Do you think that that travel was related to the Russian active measures against our electoral system?
I do.
I do, under oath. So those Russian diplomats wandering in the desert, here, Obama's top diplomats saying they were part of this Russian active measure effort. What were they trying to do? Did any of this work? And will we ever find out? It's clearly not over. I am joined by Michael McFaul, former U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration. Thanks for being here.
Sure, Ari. Thanks for having me.
What does it mean that Ms. Nuland is confirming this now? And I guess I don't have to ask you whether you, as a diplomat, did this kind of thing when you were abroad.
Well, I think it's significant that Toria did confirm it. You're absolutely right about that. And one shouldn't really be surprised that Russian diplomats are, interacting in this way. SIGINT and HUMINT, right? Human intelligence and signals intelligence intertwine, and they support each other in foreign operations like the Russians were doing in our country. That she said it on the record, though, surprised me, I got to tell you honestly.
Yeah, because why?
Because this is usually very classified information.
Right.
I know all kinds of things that I'm not going to say to you right now about what Russians have done in this country, because it's usually classified. And by the way, that's one of the biggest problems with getting Americans to be more concerned about these things is we don't talk about them in the open.
Ambassador, I know things that I don't talk about to you. They're just not as important or classified as all the things you don't tell us. I mean, what do you say to people who say, well, are we just signed on to the idea that with hostile countries that we have relations with, which can be a good thing. I mean, people believe in diplomacy, that some of those people are always going to be spies? Or does this track with something you and Rachel and many people have discussed as well earlier, which is that Russia took it farther? They also resorted to physical violence against some of our people on their territory, that this is far beyond what might be baked into the normal system.
Well, from my point of view, it's beyond normal procedures. In the last several years, both inside Russia against diplomats, including people like me when I was ambassador, but more importantly to me, what they've done inside our country goes well beyond. I want to be clear about that. It's not standard operating procedure. The hard part about cyber weapons and intelligence with respect to cyber stuff is different from, say, nuclear weapons. When we discovered Soviet nuclear weapons here and there, including most scarily during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we could tell the American people about the threat and then take actions to deter it. What's hard about these cyber activities is you don't see it, you don't witness it. We don't want to talk about it because we don't want to scare the American people. If you knew all the things I did, you would be more nervous about what Russia and other countries could do to our infrastructure. And that's what's hard about getting people animated enough about the threat, but without getting us into some scary thing that could undermine the stock market, for instance, if people knew all the things that were happening out there on our networks.
So on a serious note, I appreciate you giving us some context. On a lighter note, I guess I'm glad I'm not inside your brain, because it will be easier to go to sleep on this Friday night. Ambassador Michael McFaul, always appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks for having me.
And we have more ahead tonight. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.